Should controversial chats in pubs be banned? 0207 862 2222 is the number to give us a ring. The Equalities watchdog has warned that under Labour's workers' rights reforms, pubs could be held accountable if their customers have conversations which offend any members of staff who might be within earshot. The proposed rules say that the employers must protect workers from being harassed at work by third parties, such as customers or clients. And if they fail to do so, they could then be sued. So to ensure this doesn't happen, it could mean that pubs and cafes have to ask some customers not to talk about certain issues which might offend their workers. Do we think this is reasonable, Marvyn? You've gone into a pub, you want to have a chat with your pal, the subject of religion comes up and the owner of the pub comes over and says, you can't speak about that here. How comfortable do you feel?
I think there's very little chance of you being able to tell people you can't say what you want to say inside of a pub. What I do think is that there are zones in the world where it's like you can't have your phone, for example, you can't have your laptop out. And the invitation is that don't use this space for that type of content. I feel like people can't go outside without either being racist, misogynist, or talking about politics. It's kind of like, can we just have a chat about the news or about a TV show or in a public event? Everything seems to be politicized, and it's completely sucked not only the fun out of just dialoguing and being around people, but also it's kind of made everything a fracture. And when you go into the real world and you're around real people, you actually have nice, warm conversations, but then all of a sudden it turns into this like political hate line, but it doesn't mirror what goes on day to day. So I kind of feel very disconnected to going into some of these communal places because the tone does feel very binary. It's kind of like where I go mirrors what my values are. So I think we are going to have to try and create some sort of neutral spaces where people aren't able just to sit there and spew hate all day and just create a negative atmosphere.
Who goes into a pub, Marvyn, and spews hate? I've never heard it.
I have.
I've never heard it in my life.
London pubs are crazy.
Some of the most important ideas in human history have caused offence to people. Well,
offence to people. I would say happens in a pub.
Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, Galileo. Everything they said caused offence when they said.
I'm going to be deeply honest. Every single person you made
I speak now?
is absolutely problematic on multiple layers. And so to use them as some sort of great thinker, they're all completely red pill right-wing individuals, all of them.
OK, Carole.
No. Here we go.
I finished now, Cameron. I'm sorry.
No, but Carole's making the point that actually sometimes you have to say controversial
without being
interrupted.
Changes. I'm saying that you cannot actually tell people. We live in a country that is free speech. Free speech often offends people. But if the only time, and you need to have a very good reason to rationalise free speech. It's got to be, if we can protest on the streets about what we believe in, we should be able to talk about what we believe in. And I think the only reason you would have for limiting free speech is A, if it endangers someone, if you're making damaging accusations about them, if you're saying they're a rapist or a killer, you shouldn't be allowed to say that. If you're engaging in harassment or threats against them, but you cannot stop people from talking about trans rights issues because it's an ideology that some people believe in and some people don't. You should be allowed absolutely to say what you think.
All right, we're going to put that on pause there, but after the break, we're going to be taking your calls on this. Should pubs be able to ban customers from having conversations which might offend members of their staff? Or do you think pubs are a safe space and you should be able to talk about whatever you like? Give us a call. 0207 862 2222 is the number. Your calls on whether pubs and other hospitality-based businesses should ban customers from having controversial conversations in an attempt to protect their own employees from being offended by other people's opinions. Do you think this is a reasonable suggestion? 0207 862 2222 is the number to get in touch. And we can now go to the phone lines. We're going to speak to Clive in London. Clive, what's your thoughts on this? I believe, have you owned a pub or worked in a pub?
I used to work in a pub.
Great.
And we were always fascinated by conversations that we heard.
Yep.
But my point is that what comes next? Do we find people on checkouts who are vegan or vegetarian? I'm offended by any of them, but them saying now that, I'm sorry, but I'm offended that you're buying meat, or I'm offended, that you're buying eggs. It just becomes a little ridiculous. That it's not about people being offended, it's about shutting other people, other people's opinions. And I think this is the main thing here.
You point on a very critical part of this conversation, and that is what is offensive conversation, what is controversial conversation. For some people, breastfeeding, even talking about breastfeeding and formula, that's a controversial conversation and may cause offence. That's something that me and my friends in my mum's group would sit and chat about all day long.
Yeah.
Are we going to be banned from having those conversations?
I think a lot of it is to do with context, and I think a lot of it is also just to do with what the tone and the goal of the conversation is. If you are working in an environment and you hear people whispering about your identity or your lived experience, and no one in that conversation looks like they've come from that lived experience, it can make you feel particularly unsafe in that time. That isn't necessarily a cut and shut case, but it is a bit of a discomfort, and we should actually think, as a owner of that establishment, how do you mitigate that? So the best way to do is to create environments where those conversations aren't particularly welcomed as a whole. It's just like, talk about anything else.
Aren't there already rules around that? I mean, that would be harassment if there was a group of people that were sort of pointing and laughing or sitting and chatting about an individual while that individual was just trying to get on with their own work. An employer would be completely within their rights to ask that group to leave or change the subject at the very least. What we're talking about here is, as Clive's pointed out, is you work in a checkout, you're vegan. Do you have a right to say to a customer, or do you have a right to say to your employer, I don't want that customer to come back in because they bought a steak and I find it really offensive?
Well, look, I think there's a difference, and what everyone's worried about is the sliding scale. It's not the actual thing that's being asked. It's like, well, where does this stop? Where we are right now is the major issues that are impacting and making people feel particularly marginalised. It's about ensuring that we put things in place to make it much clearer as to when somebody is doing something that is racist, sexist, misogynist, and that's a really good thing. I think when we get into the point of just banning people from having conversations, I think, as Carole mentioned earlier, the pub is an environment to have conversations, but what we don't want to do is welcome all conversations in all tones, all manners that can cause offence, and not just like, oh, I don't like it, but actually genuinely othering someone who's working there, sitting in earshot. You want pubs to be a welcoming place. You don't want it to become a place where people are feeling very uncomfortable and choose to leave.
All right, Clive, thank you very much for your call and bringing that up. Trevor from Bournemouth, what's your view?
Well, I'm kind of thinking here, is our freedom of speech being totally sort of banished?
No, you can still say what you like within the confines of your own house.
Yep. Or in the town square.
In your own house. Trevor, you're right, it is.
You can say that in your own house, but what's wrong with me going out with my mates on a Friday night to the pub? We might be having a little bit of a laugh and discussing things that we don't see as normal. Now, if somebody finds offence by that, well, I'm sorry. That is my opinion.
Well, let's think about a situation where, and you may be completely unaware that the person serving you at your table at a pub, let's say you're having a meal, is a trans individual, and you and your friends are having a conversation about trans people and about the sort of recent controversies and debates around law changes and that sort of thing. Does that person have a right to say that they don't want to hear that conversation, they don't want to hear your views on it, they find your views offensive?
They shouldn't be listening in on my conversation, to be perfectly honest.
He's right, Trevor's completely right. If you're in a pub, unless someone is shouting at you, if there's a trans person behind the bar and someone is shouting at that trans person about the fact they're trans, that's not on. Of course it's not.
Well, if they're shouting for any reason at someone behind the bar, that shouldn't be on.
Yeah, it shouldn't be on. But we're using the thing because you brought up the subject of trans. So if he's at a table having a quiet conversation with his mates, it doesn't matter. Free speech offends people. It always has. It always will. And that we should defend people's right to say what they believe. If people are allowed to take to the streets of this country to protest of what they believe in, they should be allowed to say what they believe in a private conversation.
OK, Trevor, thank you very much for your call and your view there. And Melanie from Norwich, what's your view?
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me on. Exactly what Carole has been saying. Pubs are definitely the place where these conversations are likely to happen. Contentious, perhaps, when you're out with your friends. But sometimes you need to have those contentious conversations in order to perhaps also help educate people, see different points of view, to say, OK, have you thought about this? Or
I do wonder,
So why
actually,
would you want
Melanie,
to stifle that?
Your point, I wonder whether you have a very valid point there in that if we don't allow these conversations and these viewpoints to be aired in a public domain where people can criticise, because equally the person working could say, actually, you're not right. As a trans individual myself, I can tell you that your stats there are wrong or blah, 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 and then it opens up that conversation.
So,
if we don't, Marvyn, we could end up in a situation where we are driving these views underground, they percolate in their own, and they become an even uglier sort of beast.
But we're not talking about the conversations where we're genuinely trying to explore an idea. If you're genuinely trying to explore an idea about gender, race, age, anything, of course, that's a really important conversation.
Whether you're
but the reality
trying to do
is that most of these conversations have no goal in terms of enriching or improving or creating something for the outcomes.
Who are you to say that a conversation should enrich? Who are you to say? Hate speech laws are very subjective.
Okay.
Hate is a subjective term. What is hateful to one person is not hateful to another.
But Carol's point is valid.
Well, it's a great, which is really insulting, actually.
What's more insulting
about everything.
is somebody who lives an experience, as a black, I'll talk about a black experience because I can't talk about trans experience. As the black experience, I have had to overhear ideas around the black experience. The idea that in that I am supposed to, if I was at my job, supposed to sit there and educate that person in that moment about what the black experience truly is, I don't want to hear that in my workplace. If you haven't taken the time to inform yourself in your own time about what those questions are, me overhearing you and believing that I should shut my ears off to pretend that the conversation isn't happening while I'm supposed to be serving you is a part of the massive problem. I don't want to stop your discovery, but do your discovery in your own time. And if you want to be curious, be curious. But if you're just going to have a conversation where you're telling me who I am and what my lived experience is, that's very problematic.
I appreciate that, but I do wonder whether...
It's happening in this moment because I'm explaining to you what my experience is. And you're erasing it for the idea of free speech for a person you don't even know, for a hypothetical situation.
You want to shut it down because it's not something
about shutting it down.
You can't represent the whole black experience.
Oh, my Lord.
You can represent your experience.
I said I, and I did. I only represented I don't want that experience for me. But for you to sit there and pretend that that experience is not something to be put into the conversation and universally say that free speech is this important thing.
It is.
To be protected against
the
who?
most important.
The actual design of free speech was about making sure that you can speak against any form of power, the government, the Queen, whoever it is, and you can say that you're not happy with it.
That's not
to say that now that should be implemented and not be updated by anybody else and not be reviewed, not be looked at what the actual impact is and how it actually impacts society in a negative way is absolutely absurd. There is no wider discussion about what the impact is for free speech and the idea of free speech when you are in power and it suits you. Well, take a break then.
Why don't you take a break?
When it suits you, you're allowed to say whatever you want. As soon as people are the victim of that experience and they tell you that doesn't work for me, it's like, well, forget it. You're being soft. You're weak.
Carole,
disgraceful.
No, I don't want to talk about it.
Carole, it was very hard. You have to let Marvyn come to the end of his point, and then.
I'm sorry, Marvyn's made a lot of points.
It was a lot of points.
I'm
That's fine.
now.
But Carole,
carry on.
you can make a point now.
No, it's fine.
Can I continue then?
All right, no, because we're going to go to messages, other people's points of view. Stuart on Facebook says, this is nothing new. There's a sign behind the bar in my local saying no politics, no religion. It's generally ignored. All right. Kelly on Facebook says, as an ex-landlord, you meet some very strange people. Some will harass the female staff. Wow. Some are openly racist to customers and some are just bullies. There are times when you have to ask the person to stop or they will not be served. But I mean, that sounds like they're already doing this when these things happen. Stephen on X says, the day a pub landlord tells me that I'm allowed to talk about is the day that I brew my own beer. Well, that might be coming soon, Stephen, by the looks of things. Thank you very much for all your calls on that. We are going to have to move on.